The emerald radiance of Nexus Prime's twin suns filtered through the dense lattice of crystalline vegetation, casting jade-tinted shadows across the wreckage field that had once been the interstellar transport vessel Artemis. The ship's titanium exoskeleton lay exposed like the remains of some great mechanical beast, its hull panels scattered across the viridian undergrowth of the untamed wilderness. Acrid smoke coiled upward from the ruptured propulsion chambers, fighting against the planet's merciless gravitational pull before dissolving into the copper-flecked atmosphere. The distress transmitter emitted feeble pulses of electromagnetic radiation, its power cells nearly depleted. Not that it mattered. This far from established transit corridors, the likelihood of detection approached mathematical impossibility. On Nexus Prime, survival and salvation were equally improbable concepts. Every inhalation felt like drowning in liquid metal. The planet's atmospheric composition, rich with unfamiliar noble gases and microscopic crystalline particulates, scorched the respiratory system with each breath. The gravity, nearly 2.3 times Earth standard, transformed the most basic movements into exhausting feats of endurance. Muscles, tendons, and skeletal structure all protested against Nexus Prime's relentless downward force. Marcus Vale dragged himself from beneath a shattered navigation console, his ashen skin slick with perspiration, blood, and luminescent engine coolant that had cascaded throughout the command module during impact. His environmental suit was lacerated across the torso, revealing lean but defined musculature that quivered under the strain of merely maintaining an upright posture. Earthborn and conditioned for standard gravity environments, his physiological systems rebelled against this alien world's fundamental physics, each gesture demanding conscious determination and will. Crimson fluid trickled from a jagged wound above his left temple, dripping onto the alien soil where it sizzled faintly upon contact. Some chemical reaction between human hemoglobin and the indigenous mineral composition. The sharp, immediate agony of his physical injuries paled compared to the psychological burden he carried. Unbidden memories surfaced through his pain-hazed consciousness. The orbital mining platform orbiting Europa, Jupiter's ice-covered moon. 15 years of flawless operation under his engineering supervision. The catastrophic failure of the primary stabilization array that no predictive algorithm had anticipated. The horrifying spectacle of 60-ton extraction equipment breaking free, tumbling through microgravity toward the residential quadrant. The sickening knowledge that his wife Lyra and daughter Cassandra had been in hydroponics section 12, directly in the path of destruction. The silence afterward, the absence of communication from the residential sector, had been more devastating than the alarms that screamed throughout the facility. Lyra's gentle laugh, Cassandra's delicate hand waving from the observation window of the greenhouse dome, both extinguished in a single moment of engineering oversight, his oversight. The stabilization couplings had shown microscopic fractures during the previous maintenance cycle, anomalies he had deemed within acceptable parameters. He had fled across the solar system and beyond, accepting the first deep space transport assignment available. But the memories pursued him relentlessly, emerging in nightmares and quiet moments alike. The weight of that singular failure pressed upon him more oppressively than any alien gravitational field could hope to match. Marcus took an unsteady step away from the twisted metal carcass of the Artemis, surveying the disaster site. The transport had carved a devastating path through the emerald jungle, toppling crystalline tree analogs and pulverizing the dense vegetation for nearly 3/4 of a kilometer. Small electrical fires still flickered along the destructive trail, feeding on the strange plant matter that seemed to undulate with an almost sentient rhythm. In the distance, something massive shifted through the forest canopy, disturbed by the violent planetary arrival. A sound, something between derisive laughter and contemptuous dismissal, drew his attention upward. Perched on a jutting formation of translucent green stone above the crash site sat a humanoid figure, observing him with undisguised disdain. Her skin was a vibrant amber gold, with subtle patterns of darker bronze that shifted with her movements, catching the emerald light. Eyes of liquid obsidian, impossibly dark against her luminous complexion, evaluated him with the detached interest of an apex predator assessing wounded prey. Long, sinuous limbs folded gracefully beneath her as she maintained perfect balance on her precarious perch, head tilted in sardonic curiosity. Her hair, not hair in the human sense, but something resembling metallic filaments of burnished copper, was elaborately arranged in complex geometric patterns, adorned with small crystalline fragments and what appeared to be carved bone fragments, revealing pointed auditory receptors in a face that might have been captivating if not distorted with contempt. She wore form-fitting attire crafted from materials Marcus couldn't identify, though they resembled a combination of processed vegetation and some form of reptilian hide, patterned with intricate designs that echoed the surrounding jungle's complex geometry. "You might as well surrender to the inevitable," the golden-skinned woman called, her voice melodious despite its mocking inflection. Her command of English was perfect, suggesting either remarkable linguistic adaptation or some form of translation technology Marcus couldn't detect. "Your brittle Earth skeleton won't endure even a single planetary rotation in our gravity. Your bones will fracture like crystalline filaments at the first true challenge." She manipulated a formidable-looking weapon between fingers that terminated in short, retractable talons. The implement's shaft appeared constructed from some polished, bone-like material of considerable dimension, tipped with a crystalline blade that captured the emerald sunlight and refracted it in hypnotic patterns. Marcus squinted upward, his vision still compromised from the crash impact. "I've weathered worse circumstances," he managed, his voice raspy from smoke inhalation and the unfamiliar atmospheric composition. The words tasted metallic and bitter on his tongue. The woman, Nyx Ara, as he would later discover, released a derisive sound that exposed teeth slightly sharper than human standard, arranged in a predatory configuration. "Not on Nexus Prime you haven't," she declared with absolute certainty. She stood, maintaining flawless equilibrium on the narrow ledge, despite the punishing gravitational field that threatened to drive Marcus to his knees. "Our world destroys off-worlders, always has." She gestured expansively at the jungle surrounding them. "The atmosphere dissolves your lung tissue. The gravity ruptures your cardiac muscle. The predators detect your alien biochemistry. The flora analyzes your unfamiliar cellular structure." Her obsidian eyes narrowed to glittering slits. "Even if the crash impact didn't terminate your biological functions, the Thanator will claim you before the secondary sunset." Marcus suppressed a retort, the familiar shadow of self-recrimination silencing his defiance. He deserved her scorn, deserved worse after what he'd done. Perhaps this hostile environment was precisely where he belonged, the perfect setting for atonement through suffering. As he straightened, searing pain lancing through his ribcage where the crash restraint system had inflicted deep contusions, he detected a low, reverberating growl emanating from the dense wall of emerald foliage nearby. The sound was unlike anything in Earth's biosphere, deeper, with harmonic overtones that seemed to physically vibrate the atmospheric molecules. It triggered primal alarm responses encoded in his genetic structure, activating ancient survival mechanisms. Nyx Ara's demeanor transformed instantly, her body tensing like a compressed spring. The mockery vanished from her expression, replaced by alert vigilance. "Remain absolutely motionless," she hissed, all contempt absent from her voice, supplanted by grim urgency. Her knuckles whitened around her crystalline spear as she dropped into a defensive posture. Too late. The jungle exploded outward as a massive creature burst through the vegetation barrier. It resembled an earth feline in its basic morphology: quadrupedal locomotion, sinuous torso, predatory grace. But the similarities ended there. Half a metric ton of rippling musculature, the beast moved with impossible velocity for something of its mass. Its dorsal ridge bristled with crystalline protrusions that gleamed like polished obsidian, rising and falling with its respiratory cycles. Similar formations lined its powerful shoulders and flanks. Its hide was deep emerald with geometric patterns of midnight black, perfectly adapted to the verdant jungle environment. 8 eyes arranged in geometric formation across its elongated cranial structure glowed amber with predatory intelligence, locking onto Marcus with laser precision, evaluating the unfamiliar organism that had invaded its territory. Deep laceration marks crisscrossed its flanks, and one of its auditory appendages was partially severed, an outcast, a survivor, a being intimately acquainted with suffering and transcendence. "Flee!" Nyxara shouted, her crystalline spear raised defensively as she descended from her elevated position with impossible grace, landing in a posture that absorbed the impact despite Nexus Prime's punishing gravity. "Move toward the elevated terrain!" She was already in motion, moving laterally to divert the creature's attention from Marcus. But something in those amber ocular organs held Marcus transfixed. He saw himself reflected there, isolated, damaged, dangerous, exiled from its community as he had exiled himself from humanity. Before he could fully process his actions, instinct overriding conscious thought, he advanced rather than retreated. The predator paused, perhaps confused by prey that approached rather than fled. Then, with a roar that dislodged crystalline formations from the canopy, it charged. Its massive appendages displaced chunks of soil as it closed the distance with terrifying velocity, a blur of muscle and evolutionary killing efficiency. Nyxara cursed in her native language, a liquid stream of phonemes that required no translation. She was certain she was about to witness the Offworlder's violent termination, another casualty claimed by Nexus Prime's unforgiving ecosystem. Instead, Marcus dropped into a wide stance, center of mass lowered, and as the beast launched itself in a final attack trajectory, he seized its forward appendages mid-leap. The impact nearly drove him to his knees. Nexus Prime's gravitational field transformed the predator's mass into a crushing force that threatened to shatter his skeletal structure and separate muscle tissue from connective points. Marcus's overtaxed physiological systems screamed in biochemical protest, nerve endings transmitting emergency signals that his conscious mind overrode. Something transcending physical strength activated, the same desperate power that had driven him to displace tons of wreckage with his bare hands, searching for his family amid the destruction he had inadvertently caused. Strength born of absolute desperation. With a primal vocalization that startled even Nyxara, Marcus elevated the massive creature overhead. His facial features contorted with effort, vascular structures protruding prominently on his neck and forearms as he maintained the predator in an elevated position. Tendons and muscle groups stood out like tension cables, bunching and straining against the impossible mass. For 7 heartbeats, he held the apex predator suspended above him, its powerful limbs thrashing ineffectually in empty space. The beast struggled briefly, then grew still, amber eyes meeting Marcus's gaze in a moment of mutual recognition. Predator acknowledging predator. Survivor recognizing survivor. "Fragile bones, you claimed?" Marcus gasped, thoracic cavity heaving with respiratory effort as he carefully lowered the creature back to the ground. Perspiration cascaded down his face, his limbs trembling with fatigue. But he remained vertical, gaze locked with the predators. The great beast retreated 2 measured paces, then settled onto its haunches, massive cranium tilted in apparent assessment. It made no further aggressive movements, instead circling Marcus warily, its crystalline-tipped appendage sweeping the soil in contemplative arcs. Nyxara's facial expression registered profound astonishment. Obsidian eyes widened with disbelief. In all her cycles as a sentinel hunter, she had never witnessed such a demonstration of physical capability. Not from her own species, and certainly not from an off-worlder, fresh from atmospheric entry impact. The feat should have been physiologically impossible, especially for someone not adapted to Nexus Prime's punishing environmental parameters. Before she could respond, the undergrowth parted again, and a small figure emerged into the clearing. Another golden-skinned native, but this one barely beyond juvenile development stage. Her obsidian eyes, disproportionately large in her small facial structure, reflected unmistakable terror. Her simple attire was torn and soiled, suggesting a desperate journey through challenging terrain. "Nyxara!" the child called, rushing to the hunter's side with familiarity that suggested kinship bonds. "The Ravagers! Scout Watchers detected their war party crossing the western ridge." Nyxara knelt, grasping the child's shoulders with careful firmness. "Taya, regulate your respiratory rate. How many combatants did the Scout Watchers enumerate?" "Hundreds," the child whispered, her small frame quivering with exhaustion and fear. "With plasma weapons and gravitational disruptors. Elder Corvus says they'll reach the settlement by nightfall. She glanced at Marcus, then at the predator, her eyes widening further. Who is the pale one? Why isn't the Thanator consuming him? Both relevant inquiries. Nyx Ara murmured, her expression thoughtful as she studied Marcus with newfound assessment. Your arrival timing is either extraordinarily fortuitous or catastrophically unfortunate, Earthborn. Our community has been engaged in territorial conflict with the Ravagers for generations. She gestured at the predator. This, the Thanator accepting your proximity without hostility, is unprecedented in our recorded history. Marcus observed the massive creature, which had settled onto its haunches, monitoring the exchange with uncanny intelligence. Its 8 eyes blinked in sequential patterns, the motion hypnotically rhythmic. Making an instantaneous decision that felt correct on an intuitive level he couldn't articulate, he approached the beast, extending his hand palm downward. The Thanator investigated it, olfactory organs flaring, then, to Nyx Ara's visible astonishment, permitted Marcus to place his hand on its massive cranium, the crystalline protrusions flattening to accommodate his touch. With deliberate movements, he positioned himself on its broad dorsal surface, finding a secure position between the spinal formations. I'm accompanying you, he stated simply. The declaration surprised him as much as it did Nyx Ara, but he didn't retract it. What awaited him here besides gradual termination beside the wreckage? At minimum, this course of action might give his inevitable end some purpose. Nyx Ara hesitated briefly before nodding, a decision equally swift and pragmatic. Attempt not to fall and fracture your vertebral column before we reach the settlement, she said. But the mockery had lost its edge, tempered by reluctant respect. With Taya secured to her back, small arms encircling her chin, Nyx Ara accelerated to a sprint that should have been impossible in such gravitational conditions. Her powerful lower limbs propelled her forward in arcing trajectories that consumed distance efficiently, navigating the dense vegetation with the practiced ease of one evolved for this environment. The Thanator followed, carrying Marcus through the alien forest at a velocity that transformed the emerald foliage into a verdant blur. Its gait was remarkably fluid despite the challenging terrain, its 8 eyes constantly scanning for potential threats as they penetrated deeper into Nexus Prime's wilderness. Their route took them through dense groves of crystalline vegetation that resembled terrestrial bamboo in structure, but were semi-translucent and pulsating, exuding a sweet-scented resin where they made contact. Massive flower analogs with structures resembling polished metal sheets tracked their movement, rotating to follow them like grotesque solar collectors. Overhead, organisms with transparent wing membranes darted between the upper branches, their high-frequency vocalizations echoing in the dense atmosphere. The settlement lies beyond the Great Divide, Nyx Ara called over her shoulder as they navigated a particularly dense thicket. We can reach it before the secondary sunset if we don't encounter... She interrupted herself as the ground beneath them vibrated violently. Fine particulate matter danced upward, suspended momentarily before settling again. A deep resonance rose from below, more felt than heard. Fracture patterns appeared zigzagging through the soil like electrical discharges drawn in 3 dimensions. The vibrations intensified, and suddenly the ground split open before them, a widening chasm that tore across their path. The fissure expanded with terrifying velocity, releasing sulfurous yellow vapors that irritated Marcus's eyes and respiratory system. Tectonic shift, Nyx Ara cried, veering sharply rightward, seeking a narrower crossing point. The planet's crust is realigning. Don't inhale the thermal emissions. The Thanator compressed its powerful musculature and launched without hesitation, Marcus clinging desperately to its crystalline dorsal formations. For a breathless moment, they were airborne, the widening gap passing beneath them with its noxious yellow emanations reaching upward like grasping appendages. They soared over the expanding chasm, the Thanator's powerful posterior limbs propelling them far enough to land mere centimeters from the crumbling edge on the opposite side. Nyx Ara, with Taya's arms locked around her neck, followed, her powerful limbs propelling her across the divide in a graceful arc. But as she landed, the edge began to disintegrate beneath her, a vine she grasped for stability, separating with an acoustic crack, sending her sliding backward toward the abyss, loose soil cascading around her. Taya screamed, her small hands scrabbling for purchase on the unstable surface. They slid further, the edge continuing to deteriorate under their combined mass. Without hesitation, Marcus dismounted from the Thanator's back, lunged forward, and seized Nyxara's wrist as she teetered on the precipice. The strain of supporting both her and Taya against Nexus Prime's gravitational pull threatened to dislocate his shoulder joint, the musculature burning with the effort. Earth-conditioned tendons stretched to their physiological limit as the ground continued to crumble beneath them. He gritted his teeth and pulled, dragging them upward centimeter by painful centimeter as the ledge disintegrated beneath their weight. The Thanator positioned itself alongside, its mass stabilizing the edge, as Marcus executed one final effort, pulling the pair to safety. They collapsed together on solid terrain, respiratory systems working at maximum capacity as a final cascade of fragmented rock tumbled into the sulfurous depths. The chasm continued to widen for several more moments before the planetary tremor subsided, leaving a gap nearly 30 meters across where their path had been. "Acknowledged," Nyxara murmured, her obsidian eyes meeting his briefly. There was no mockery now, just a warrior's recognition of obligation incurred. Before Marcus could respond, a high-pitched, penetrating cry echoed overhead. Nyxara's complexion paled to a lighter shade of gold, her eyes darting upward with unmistakable alarm. "Aerial hunters," she hissed, pulling Taya close against her side. They hunt in coordinated groups, attracted to movement and acoustic emissions. The tectonic shift must have disturbed their nesting site. From the high canopy, a dozen winged organisms descended in tight formation. Their bodies were elongated and covered in reflective scales rather than dermal coverings. Their wing structures consisting of transparent membranes stretched between elongated digits that terminated in curved talons. But it was their oral structures that captured Marcus's attention. Serrated like precision cutting tools, they gleamed with predatory purpose as the flock descended toward the group with coordinated precision. Marcus retrieved a fallen branch, evaluating its mass and balance properties in one fluid motion. As the first aerial hunter dove toward Taya, he swung the improvised weapon in a wide arc, years of low-gravity baseball experience guiding his aim. The impact sent the creature spiraling away with a damaged wing membrane and an indignant vocalization. Beside him, the Thanator disabled another from the air with a powerful forelimb, its talons shredding through the delicate wing structure. Nyxara's crystalline spear claimed a third with lethal accuracy, the translucent tip penetrating directly through the hunter's narrow thoracic cavity. But they were numerically disadvantaged, and the aerial hunter's mobility provided significant tactical advantage. They dove and maneuvered, their attack patterns becoming increasingly aggressive as they detected the biochemical signatures of their injured companions. A fourth hunter evaded Marcus's defensive perimeter, executing a low-altitude, high-velocity approach. Its serrated oral structure lacerated Nyxara's upper appendage before she could deflect, drawing a bright golden fluid that contrasted starkly against her amber skin. With a vocalization of rage that surprised even himself, Marcus captured the offending creature mid-flight, his fingers encircling its slender neck structure. With a wrenching motion born of fury rather than calculation, he separated one of its wing membranes completely before hurling the shrieking organism into the undergrowth. "You're injured," he said, tearing a section from his already damaged environmental suit. The fabric, designed for deep space conditions, possessed surprising durability and sterility. "This requires attention." "It's inconsequential," she replied dismissively, but remained stationary as he secured the improvised bandage around her wound, stemming the flow of her strangely luminescent golden circulatory fluid. Her gaze lingered on his facial features as he worked, studying him with an intensity that made him acutely aware of the grime and blood that still streaked to his features from the crash impact. Taya huddled against Nyxara's side, eyes wide with fear and fascination as she observed the interaction. "You combat like the champions in the ancient narratives," she whispered to Marcus, her juvenile voice solemn with wonder. The remaining aerial hunters circled once more, their high-frequency vocalizations communicating among themselves in some predatory language. Then, as if reaching a collective decision, they retreated, their translucent forms disappearing into the elevated canopy from which they had emerged. We should continue forward, Nixara said, adjusting the bandage. The biochemical emissions will attract additional predators, more dangerous variants. They pressed onward, the jungle growing denser and more challenging with each kilometer. The vegetation transformed subtly, the emerald hues darkening to deep jade and violet. The atmosphere grew more saturated with reproductive spores and the complex aromatic compounds of decay. Massive flower analogues with structures resembling polished metal sheets unfurled as they passed, releasing clouds of shimmering particulates that irritated Marcus's eyes and caused dermal discomfort where they settled. One reproductive structure, larger than the others, suddenly expanded fully as Taya passed near it, revealing a glistening central cavity surrounded by prehensile filaments. With terrifying velocity, the filaments extended, encircling Taya's lower limb and dragging her toward the plant's digestive chamber with surprising mechanical advantage. The child screamed, clawing at the ground as she was pulled inexorably toward the biological trap. "Nixara, assist me!" Her obsidian eyes were wide with terror as the carnivorous plant drew her closer to its digestive cavity, which glistened with caustic enzymatic fluids. Marcus launched himself forward without conscious deliberation, seizing the vine-like filaments with his unprotected hands. They possessed unexpected tensile strength and were coated with an adhesive substance that caused chemical burns where it contacted his dermal layer. Undeterred, he began dismantling them through sheer mechanical force, vocalizing with effort as he separated the vegetable tissue manually. The plant responded aggressively, deploying twice as many filaments, these thicker and possessing greater tensile strength than the original set. They coiled around Marcus's appendages with constricting force, attempting to neutralize this unexpected resistance. Nixara, acting with tactical efficiency, retrieved a fallen branch, ignited its terminus using a small device from her equipment harness, and thrust the combustion point into the center of the carnivorous bloom. The plant emitted a high-frequency acoustic emission that sounded disturbingly sentient, modulating in what could only be interpreted as a distress response as combustion consumed its reproductive structures. The filaments convulsed, releasing both Taya and Marcus as the entire organism collapsed inward, retreating into a defensive configuration that smoldered and released particulate matter. Marcus and Nixara retreated, both bearing minor injuries but functionally intact. Taya clung to Nixara, trembling, her small golden limbs marked with angry lesions, where the filaments had maintained their grip. "Your planetary environment truly discourages visitors," Marcus gasped, restoring circulation to his constricted limbs. The burning sensation where the plant's secretions had contacted his dermal layer was beginning to diminish, replaced by a concerning absence of sensation. The corner of Nixara's mouth adjusted in what might almost have been an expression of amusement. "It evaluates all organisms, even those evolved here," she replied, examining Taya's injuries with practiced efficiency, applying a medicinal compound from a small container in her equipment harness to the inflamed lesions. "The adaptable survive, the maladapted become nutrients or organic substrate. Is every organism on this planet attempting to terminate biological functions?" Marcus inquired, observing as the Thanator investigated the smoldering plant remains with cautious olfactory assessment. "Not every organism," Nixara responded, her gaze shifting to the great predator. "Some recognize evolutionary kinship." The words were quiet, seemingly not intended for his auditory reception, and she provided no elaboration. As if to emphasize her observations regarding Nexus Prime's hostility, the atmospheric conditions changed abruptly, cloud formations accumulating with unnatural velocity from the horizon. The illumination shifted from emerald to deep violet, casting ominous shadows across the jungle floor. The first liquid precipitation impacted the broad leaves above them with an alarming acoustic signature, and where the droplets landed, the vegetation began releasing vapors, minute perforations appearing in the waxy surfaces. "Acidic precipitation," Nixara announced grimly, gathering Taya into her arms. "We require immediate shelter." She scanned the vicinity rapidly, her experienced visual reception seeking any natural formation that might provide protection. There, she indicated a rock outcropping, barely visible through the dense vegetation. That geological formation may contain natural caverns. They sprinted through the undergrowth, the Thanator leading with the uncanny navigational ability. The caustic droplets began falling more heavily, sizzling where they contacted exposed dermal layers. Marcus experienced a burning sensation where one landed on his forearm, leaving a small, painful lesion. Nyxara positioned a large leaf over Tasha's head, shielding the child as best she could as they ran. Finally, the Thanator disappeared into a narrow opening in the rock formation, the entrance almost invisible until they were directly upon it. The others followed in close succession, the shelter of solid mineral material providing immediate relief from the deadly precipitation. Inside, protected from the caustic rainfall, Nyxara created a small energy source using dry vegetation she had gathered near the cave entrance in her ignition device. The illumination cast dancing shadows on the cavern walls, revealing ancient markings partially obscured by mineral deposits, evidence that intelligent beings had sheltered here in distant temporal periods. The Thanator positioned itself near the entrance, its massive form blocking most of the opening, amber eyes fixed vigilantly on the hostile external environment. The acidic precipitation hissed and bubbled against the rock exterior, creating an otherworldly percussion against the stone. In the flickering illumination, Nyxara's features appeared softer, less guarded. The gold of her skin took on a warm bronze cast in the firelight, the patterns more visible. Subtle geometrical configurations that Marcus now recognized were not decorative, but natural evolutionary adaptations. Taya had surrendered to exhaustion, her small form curled against the Thanator's warm flank, respiratory functions slow and regular in deep sleep. My genetic relation, my brother, was Taya's primary caregiver, Nyxara said quietly, breaking the silence between them. She manipulated a small branch in the energy source, not meeting Marcus's gaze. He suffered termination fighting the Ravagers 3 seasonal cycles past during an incursion similar to the one approaching now. Her fingers traced patterns in the cave particulate matter, abstract configurations that might have held symbolic meaning. I was conducting surveillance in the elevated territories when they attacked. I couldn't intervene in time. She looked up then, obsidian eyes reflecting the flames. That's why she remains in my care now. I'm her only remaining familial connection. Marcus stared into the energy source, visualizing other fires, other losses. The flaming wreckage he had dismantled with his bare hands, searching desperately for survivors that no longer existed. The memorial pyres, the empty living quarters he couldn't bring himself to enter afterward. I terminated my family, he stated flatly, the words like solid objects in his throat. His voice lacked modulation, the emotion too vast to be expressed through mere vocal inflection. I was operating an orbital mining extraction mechanism in the Jupiter system, the largest in the northern hemisphere. I had performed the function for 15 orbital cycles without significant incident. He extended his hands before him, examining the calluses, the scars, the fresh abrasions from the day's challenges. There was a structural defect in the stabilization array. The inspection protocols failed to identify it. I failed to identify it. The payload mass was within established parameters, but the stress fractures. He closed his eyes, but the images projected with perfect clarity against his eyelids, with merciless precision. 20 metric tons of extraction equipment. My partner Lyra had brought our daughter Cassandra to observe the operations, a surprise midday meal. They were on the observation platform when the stabilization array collapsed. His voice faltered almost imperceptibly, then continued with mechanical steadiness, along with 14 others. Complete biological termination. He flexed his hands, the musculature rippling beneath pale dermal tissue. I engage in physical exertion now to validate my continued existence, to experience something besides the guilt. Physical discomfort is less complex. The silence that followed wasn't empty, but filled with shared grief, unexpected understanding. It stretched between them like an invisible connection, a bond formed in the crucible of loss and survival. It was interrupted only by the steady percussion of the acidic storm outside and the occasional adjustment of their small energy source. "What motivates your resistance against the Ravagers?" Marcus asked eventually, genuinely curious about this fierce golden-skinned woman and her community. Nyxara's expression hardened, her earlier vulnerability receding behind the mask of the warrior. They believe Nexus Prime belongs exclusively to those with sufficient strength to claim territory. They raid, they destroy, they terminate, not merely for resources but for entertainment. Her hand moved unconsciously to a decorative arrangement of small, crystalline fragments in carved bone that hung at her throat. My people believe in equilibrium. We extract only what we require. We honor the planetary cycles. We preserve knowledge. She gestured to the ancient markings on the cavern walls. These were created by my ancestors, recordings of stellar cycles and migration patterns. The Ravagers destroy such records wherever they discover them. They value only conquest. As she spoke, Marcus noticed details he had overlooked previously: the precision of her movements, the complex patterns woven into her attire, the careful methodology she applied to treating Taya's injuries. There was sophisticated culture here, advanced understanding masked by what off-worlders might misinterpret as primitive technology. They conversed through the extended hours of the atmospheric disturbance, sharing fragments of their respective worlds. Marcus described Earth's oceanic systems and mountain ranges, its urban centers and technological achievements. Nixara spoke of Nexus Prime's seasonal variations, its diverse ecosystems, the complex interrelationships between its flora and fauna. Despite their differences, commonalities emerged: respect for physical capability, appreciation of aesthetic experiences, understanding of sacrifice. When the dual suns finally reappeared, the acidic precipitation had ceased, leaving the jungle steaming under the emerald light. They emerged cautiously from their shelter, muscles stiff from extended periods of inactivity on the unyielding stone surface. The Thanator stretched, its spinal formations extending to their maximum height before returning to their normal configuration. The tranquility of the morning shattered almost immediately. 3 Ravager scouts, their golden skin decorated with black geometric patterns that emphasized their aggressive expressions, attacked from concealed positions. They had clearly been waiting, anticipating the group's emergence from the cavern. One launched a barbed projectile with practiced accuracy, the weapon emitting a high-pitched sound as it sliced through the atmosphere toward Marcus's thoracic cavity. Only a last-moment evasive maneuver prevented penetration, the projectile embedding itself in the trunk of a crystalline growth behind him with a solid impact. Responding instantaneously, Marcus produced a sharp acoustic signal, a command that emerged instinctively, somehow certain the Thanator would comprehend. The massive predator responded immediately, accelerating past him with a vocalization that dislodged crystalline fragments from the canopy, its powerful stride carrying it directly toward 2 of the scouts, forcing them backward toward a nearby cliff edge. In panic, one lost equilibrium during his retreat, upper limbs moving ineffectually as he fell from the precipice. His vocalization echoed as he descended, terminating abruptly after several seconds. Nixar engaged the second scout with fluid grace, her crystalline weapon functioning as a natural extension of her physiological structure. The Ravager demonstrated skill, deflecting her initial offensive action with his own implement, but her secondary attack found its target, the crystalline tip penetrating his thoracic cavity with lethal precision. His expression registered cognitive termination as he collapsed. The third scout, observing his companion's rapid defeat, attempted to flee, but Marcus's reflexes, honed by years of precise mechanical operation and now enhanced by Nexus Prime's challenges, served him effectively. He propelled himself forward, incapacitating the Ravager from behind. They struggled across the ground, the scout's superior adaptation to the gravitational field nearly counterbalancing Marcus's raw physical power. During the altercation, a thin cylindrical container fell from the scout's equipment harness, unrolling as it impacted the ground. Marcus glimpsed markings, a crude but detailed topographical representation showing the layout of a settlement with defensive positions clearly indicated in annotations using an unfamiliar symbolic system. With a final application of force, Marcus immobilized the Ravager, positioning one knee against his tracheal structure. The scout's obsidian eyes protruded, his golden complexion darkening as oxygen transfer was interrupted. After a brief struggle, he lost consciousness. "Betrayal," Nixara hissed, retrieving the topographical representation after confirming her opponent's biological termination. Her expression reflected intense anger as she examined the markings. Someone has been transmitting information about our defensive configurations and patrol schedules. She looked up, her obsidian eyes hard as polished stone. We must proceed immediately. If reconnaissance units have penetrated this far into our territory, the main assault force cannot be distant. They departed, leaving the unconscious scout where he had fallen. His survival or termination would proceed according to Nexus Prime's uncompromising natural selection, and continued at an accelerated pace. The Thanator now transported both Marcus and Taya, the child positioned before him, small hands gripping the Predator's crystalline dorsal formations. Nyxara moved alongside, her endurance apparently limitless as she navigated the increasingly familiar terrain. The jungle began to thin as they progressed, giving way to more deliberately managed areas. Vegetation grew in systematic patterns, their properties clearly being cultivated for specific applications. Hydraulic management systems, ingeniously designed to leverage natural water movement, intersected the landscape. They reached the outskirts of the settlement by midday, but instead of the organized, functional community Marcus had anticipated, they encountered chaos. Structural habitations constructed from local vegetation and supported by frameworks of processed crystalline material burned fiercely, releasing plumes of acrid smoke into the atmosphere. The carefully maintained cultivation areas had been trampled, their contents scattered across pathways paved with fitted stone. Ravager combatants swarmed through breached defensive perimeters, golden skinned like Nyxara's people, but adorned with elaborate scarification and bone ornamentation that gave them a fearsome appearance. Their battle vocalizations echoed across the settlement, guttural and triumphant, as they forced the defenders backward toward the center of the community. In the focal point of the conflict stood Elder Corvus, an imposing figure even injured and surrounded. Taller than most community members, with elaborately arranged copper filaments that extended to his waist, clad in ceremonial protective covering, fashioned from the processed hide of some significant predator, he fought with the vitality of a much younger organism. His crystalline weapon operated ceaselessly, claiming ravager after ravager. But the attackers pressed closer with each temporal unit, their numerical advantage beginning to manifest. Marcus assessed the tactical situation with the calculating perspective of a mining operations supervisor accustomed to managing complex three-dimensional spatial relationships under hazardous conditions. Left perimeter, he directed Nyxara, indicating where the Ravager forces appeared least concentrated. I'll engage the right sector with the Thanator. We can divide their attention. Understanding immediately, she nodded sharply, altering course after securing Taya in a concealed recess just outside the settlement boundary with strict instructions to remain hidden. What followed was unmitigated chaos. Nyxara's crystalline projectiles flew with deadly accuracy, each finding a vital target: trachea, ocular organ, cardiac region. The Ravagers, unprepared for an assault from behind, hesitated in their advance, several turning to confront this unexpected threat, while others continued to press their attack on Elder Corvus and his protective unit. Marcus, for his part, entered the conflict zone astride the Thanator, the great predator functioning like a war mount from ancient Earth mythology. The beast appeared to comprehend the situation instinctively, its massive form driving through the Ravager formation with devastating effect. Marcus had retrieved a fallen weapon, wielding it not with Nyxara's practiced precision, but with overwhelming force, driving enemies backward through sheer physical power. He propelled dense mineral formations that no native of Nexus Prime could have lifted, each finding its target with devastating impact, fracturing bone and tissue with equal effectiveness. The Thanator tore through enemy ranks, its crystalline tail extensions lashing out with lethal precision, its talons disemboweling any Ravager unfortunate enough to come within striking distance. The settlement defenders, observing this unexpected reinforcement, rallied. Warriors who had been retreating now maintained their positions, drawing courage from the spectacle of an off-worlder fighting alongside the apex predator, an omen unprecedented in their cultural memory. To me, Elder Corvus's voice resonated across the battlefield. Form the protective formation. Secure the knowledge repository. The defenders responded, assuming a practice configuration around a central structure more elaborate than the others, constructed from a framework of massive crystalline formations and covered with processed animal hide decorated with complex symbolic representations. It clearly held special cultural significance. Marcus directed the Thanator toward a group of Ravagers attempting to outflank this defensive perimeter. The great predator responded to his subtle guidance as if they shared a neural connection. Together, they drove the attackers back, providing the defenders critical temporal advantage to reinforce their position. They were altering the tactical momentum, the Ravagers' initial advantage of surprise now neutralized, when catastrophe manifested. A Ravager projectile specialist, positioned on an elevated platform constructed from interlocked crystalline formations, prepared a barbed projectile with deliberate precision. He tracked Marcus's movement through the conflict, waiting for the optimal moment to release his deadly missile. The projectile flew with perfect accuracy, streaking toward Marcus's unprotected dorsal region as he dismounted briefly to assist a fallen defender. The Thanator perceived the threat. With a powerful leap that seemed to defy even Nexus Prime's crushing gravitational field, the Predator intercepted the projectile, which penetrated deep into its thoracic cavity with a sickening impact. A second projectile followed before Marcus could react, striking the Thanator again as it shielded him with its own physical form. This one penetrated more deeply, finding vital organs that not even the great Predator's remarkable physiological resilience could withstand. The Thanator collapsed, its massive form shuddering as its circulatory fluids soaked into Nexus Prime's receptive soil. Marcus knelt beside it, his hands moving instinctively to extract the projectiles, even knowing biological termination was inevitable. The creature's amber eyes, all 8, fixed on Marcus's face with unmistakable intentionality. A final communication between organisms that had recognized something fundamental in each other. This sacrifice was unnecessary, Marcus began, but verbal expression failed him as the Thanator's respiratory function ceased, its massive cranium growing heavy in his hands. The connection they had formed, inexplicable but undeniable, severed with the creature's biological termination. Something primal and elemental rose within Marcus then, a rage born of accumulated loss and self-recrimination. It surged through his system like superheated metal, eliminating hesitation and fear, leaving only lethal purpose. Nyxara appeared at his side, her own conflict temporarily abandoned. Her obsidian eyes assessed the scene, comprehending immediately what had transpired. Without verbal communication, I placed her ceremonial weapon in his hands, an honor and acknowledgement that would have been inconceivable hours earlier. "Avenge," she said simply, her obsidian eyes hard as polished stone. The Ravager commander had entered the conflict zone, a scarred colossus nearly twice Marcus's height, his golden skin darkened to deep bronze with intricate patterns of ritualistic scarification. He wielded an energy weapon, some technology or natural phenomenon Marcus couldn't identify, generating plasma discharges along its length. Where it struck, organic material charred and blackened instantly. Behind him, a community member from Nyxara's settlement smirked triumphantly, his posture indicating alignment with the victorious faction. His attire matched the defenders, but he stood among the Ravagers without apprehension or injury. "I betrayed Elder Corvus," the turncoat announced, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "The ancient ways are obsolete. The Ravagers will dominate Nexus Prime, and I'll occupy a position of authority when—" His boast terminated prematurely as Nyxara's throwing implement found his trachea with perfect accuracy. The traitor's eyes widened in shock, his hands moving to the blade embedded to the hilt in his respiratory structure. He collapsed to his knees, then forward onto the ground, his betrayal rewarded with an ignominious end. But his treachery had already inflicted its damage. The Ravager commander, enraged by his informant's termination, attacked with his energy weapon. The discharge scorched across Marcus's arm as he barely evaded the full impact, leaving a cauterized wound that penetrated fabric and dermal layer alike. The pain was excruciating, nerve endings transmitting emergency signals as tissue carbonized. But Marcus channeled the sensation, utilizing it to fuel the rage now driving his actions. Thinking tactically, He retrieved a smoldering structural component from a burning habitation and propelled it into a mass of dry vegetative material that extended along one boundary of the settlement clearing. It ignited immediately, creating a barrier of combustion that momentarily separated the conflict zone and disoriented the Ravager forces. Using the confusion, Marcus circled behind the commander, moving with velocity and determination that defied his non-native physiological structure. The Ravager leader discharged his weapon repeatedly, each emission missing Marcus by minimal distance as he evaded and maneuvered, leading the massive combatant toward the nearby water channel where the substrate was less stable. The pursuit drew them away from the main conflict, precisely as Marcus had intended. The commander's physical mass, an advantage in direct confrontation, operated against him as he pursued the smaller, more agile off-worlder through the dense vegetation and across uneven terrain. His respiratory function became labored, his scarred facial structure contorted with frustration and increasing fatigue. Finally, with the water channel at his back, Marcus feinted leftward, then evaded rightward. The commander overextended, momentarily unbalanced, and Marcus seized his opportunity. With a final application of strength, he tackled the massive Ravager, both plunging into the water channel's swift current. Submerged, Marcus secured his arms around the thrashing combatant, utilizing his Earth-evolved musculature, tempered by exposure to Nexus Prime's punishing gravitational field, to maintain the Ravager beneath the surface. The struggle was intense, the commander's strength nearly matching Marcus's despite his compromised condition. Gaseous emissions escaped from the Ravager's oral and nasal cavities as he fought, his obsidian eyes wide with escalating panic. The underwater engagement seemed eternal, but finally the thrashing ceased, the Ravager's body becoming unresponsive, his eyes staring sightlessly through the turbid water. Marcus maintained his hold for additional moments, ensuring the threat was truly neutralized, before releasing his grip and surfacing with a desperate respiratory intake. He dragged himself onto the channel bank, saturated and gasping, his musculature trembling with exhaustion. But the conflict continued in the settlement, and without their commander, the Ravagers might retreat, or fight with even greater desperation. Gathering his remaining strength, Marcus returned toward the settlement. The scene that greeted him was one of calculated chaos. The tactical advantage had indeed shifted. Nyxara stood atop a collapsed habitation, distributing death with her remaining projectiles, each launch finding its target with uncanny precision. The defenders had formed a wedge formation, driving the disorganized Ravagers back toward the jungle perimeter. Marcus rejoined the conflict, his determination undiminished by the commander's termination. He fought now with cold calculation rather than heated rage, utilizing fallen weapons and his extraordinary physical capability to fracture the enemy's remaining tactical cohesion. Together, he and Nyxara became the dual focal points of the defense, her precision and velocity complementing his raw power and surprising endurance. Gradually, the Ravager forces dispersed and fled, until the final invader had either fallen or escaped into the surrounding vegetation. Silence descended over the settlement like a protective covering, interrupted only by the combustion of dying fires and the vocalizations of the injured. The deceased, too numerous, remained where they had fallen, both Ravager and community members alike. Marcus stood among them, covered in circulatory fluid, both crimson and golden, his physical form a canvas of lacerations, contusions, and thermal injuries, yet somehow still functional, still defiant. As the primary sun painted the atmosphere with streaks of golden green, Elder Corvus approached Marcus where he sat beside the Thanator's massive form. The elder leaned heavily on a ceremonial staff, his own injuries bandaged, but his eyes remained clear and penetrating despite his advanced developmental stage and physical trauma. He carried himself with unmistakable dignity, his copper filaments now unrestrained around his shoulders, moving slightly in the morning atmospheric current. "You lost your companion," Corvus said, placing a weathered golden hand on Marcus's shoulder. His voice was deep, textured by temporal progression, but resonant with authority, "and preserved our community. You belong here now, off-worlder, should you desire it." Marcus looked up, meeting Nyxara's gaze where she stood a short distance away. Her obsidian eyes, typically so guarded, now held something new: respect, warmth, perhaps something more profound. She had fought with incredible efficiency throughout the night, her projectiles claiming more Ravager lives than any other defender, her tactical insight altering the conflict at crucial junctures. "Your physical resilience exceeds my initial assessment," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the stillness. It wasn't precisely an apology for her earlier derision, but it represented acknowledgement. Warrior to warrior, survivor to survivor. "You provided purpose for my continued existence," he replied, the simple truth surprising even himself. It wasn't merely the Thanator he had sought to avenge, not only his family he had attempted to redeem. Something about this fierce golden-skinned woman had reawakened determination he had believed terminated with Lyra and Cassandra, a desire to protect, to construct, to belong. The temporal cycles that followed brought numerous transformations, both for Marcus and for the community that had integrated him. He interred the Thanator on an elevated plateau overlooking the settlement, marking the location with crystalline formations arranged in a pattern that echoed the Predator's distinctive dorsal structure. From one of its fallen defensive projections, he crafted an ornamental object, manipulating the material with patient dedication until it contained a perfect miniature representation of the great Predator. This talisman he presented to Nyx Ara during their bonding ceremony 4 seasonal cycles later, a commitment forged in loss and conflict, a new beginning for both organisms. The ceremony, conducted by Elder Corvus himself, integrated traditions from Earth and Nexus Prime, creating something innovative and meaningful in its hybridization. Under Marcus's guidance, the settlement's defensive systems evolved. He instructed the community to utilize the jungle itself to their tactical advantage, how to position geological formations to create natural fortifications where attackers would be channeled into predetermined zones, how to use topographical features as entrapments for potential invaders. His knowledge of mechanical principles and structural engineering, applied to Nexus Prime's unique environmental parameters, created defensive works that appeared to develop organically from the landscape itself. Nyx Ara established a new classification of reconnaissance specialists, training young warriors in methodologies that integrated her traditional knowledge with Marcus's external perspective. Together, they created an early warning network that extended for significant distances in all directions, ensuring no threat could approach undetected. The Ravagers, their operational capacity compromised and their leader terminated, retreated to the distant mountain ranges. Occasional limited engagements still occurred, but nothing approaching the full-scale assault that had nearly destroyed the settlement. Under Corvus's leadership, and later, after his peaceful biological conclusion, under the joint guidance of Marcus and Nyx Ara, the community expanded and prospered. Their offspring developed with broad skeletal structures and powerful musculature, combining Marcus's Earth-evolved strength with Nyx Ara's Nexus Prime adaptations. Their progeny inherited her deadly accuracy and his strategic cognition, becoming the youngest hunt coordinator in the community's recorded history. The children's dermal coloration manifested a unique intermediate shade, neither the pale tone of their progenitor nor the deep gold of their maternal source, but a subtle bronze that identified them as something evolutionarily novel under Nexus Prime's emerald illumination. Marcus's own pale dermal layer darkened over the decades, altered by exposure to the alien solar radiation and marked with honorable evidence of hunting expeditions and defensive actions. Though he never fully developed the golden hue of the indigenous population, the years integrated him into the community's structure until few recalled he had once been considered an outsider. His knowledge of Earth became the foundation for new cultural narratives shared around evening energy sources. His memories of oceanic systems and mountain ranges enriched the community's understanding of the universe beyond their world. The knowledge repository, which he had helped defend during that initial conflict, became his secondary operational center. There he collaborated with the community's information custodians, adding earth sciences to Nexus Prime's organic wisdom, creating a hybrid understanding that served the population effectively as they confronted the ever-evolving challenges of their environment. Nyx Ara remained a hunter even as her responsibilities expanded, her crystalline spear as lethal in her 6th decade as it had been in her 3rd. But her obsidian eyes, once cold with suspicion of all non-native organisms, now reflected wisdom tempered with compassion. Together, she and Marcus trained generation after generation of warriors and hunters, transmitting their hard-won knowledge to ensure the community's continued survival. Decades later, seated by a domestic energy source surrounded by juvenile descendants eager for narratives of historical events, Marcus and Nixara maintained physical contact, the years evident in their lined facial features and altered hair coloration. His once lean physical structure had developed thick musculature earned through a lifetime in Nexus Prime's intense gravitational field. Hers remained lithe but bearing the indicators of a warrior's existence: honorable scarification, healed skeletal fractures, the subtle asymmetry of a joint once dislocated and realigned under field conditions. Around them, the settlement that had once approached termination now thrived. New habitations extended in all directions, their designs integrating traditional materials with innovations Marcus had introduced. Cultivation areas flourished, yielding abundant harvests of nutrient sources adapted to human consumption alongside native varieties. The defensive perimeters, now more symbolic than functional, stood as reminders of more hazardous temporal periods and the vigilance required to prevent their recurrence. Beyond their dwelling, the jungle stretched to the horizon, vast and mysterious. It remained dangerous, as all truly wild environments must, but its greatest threats had been mitigated, not through dominance but through comprehension. The community now navigated the Emerald Wilderness with confidence derived from profound knowledge, respecting its hazards while utilizing its resources. "Do you ever experience cognitive discomfort regarding your decision?" Nixara asked. Her voice softened by age, but her obsidian eyes still bright in her golden face. "Remaining, you could have signaled a passing vessel, return to your stellar community." Marcus tightened his grip on her hand, appreciating the perfect ergonomic compatibility in his own, golden and pale, alien and familiar. Two components of a unified system neither could have envisioned during that initial encounter beside the wreckage. "Not for a single temporal unit," he replied with absolute certainty. A juvenile descendant, barely 5 seasonal cycles in development, with dermal coloration resembling twilight, climbed onto his lap, indicating excitedly at the ornamental object that still hung around Nixara's neck. "Narrate about the Thanator companion," the child demanded, using the designation that had become legendary in community lore. Marcus smiled, exchanging a glance with Nixara that encompassed decades of shared experiences. "Well," he began, settling into the familiar rhythm of a narrative recounted many times before, "it initiated when my spacecraft impacted on Nexus Prime, where gravitational forces confined you to the planetary surface, and emerald jungles resonated with potential termination. Their narrative had achieved completion, a chronicle of an Earth-evolved human and a Nexus Prime hunter, of loss and redemption, of discovering belonging in the most unexpected coordinates." As darkness descended over the emerald jungles, Marcus Vale, once a fractured individual fleeing his past, surveyed the family unit he had constructed and the world he had helped preserve, and recognized that some catastrophic landings were, in their unique way, the gentlest of arrivals.